Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're putting on our neutral international relations researcher hats to dive into a seriously provocative claim, Professor Jiang's hypothesis that World War III has already begun. We're going to completely strip away the sensationalism today. Just step back and look purely at the cold, hard geopolitical incentives at play. But hey, before we get started, if you value objective, data-driven deep dives into global affairs, definitely make sure to subscribe to this channel, Conflict Explained, for more neutral geopolitical analysis.
Okay, so here's our academic syllabus for today. We'll start by unpacking the World War hypothesis, look into U.S. grand strategy and Iran's defense, check out how Russia and China intervene, and then wrap up by looking at the potential for systemic collapse.
Let's jump right into Section 1. The World War Hypothesis.
So, has World War III already begun? Well, according to Professor Jiang's framework, he actually assigns an 80 to 90% probability to this exact claim. But to really get this, we have to look at how he defines modern global conflict. He views World War III not as this sudden Hollywood-style apocalyptic flash of nuclear weapons. Instead, he sees it as an inevitable, systemic expansion of the regional conflicts we're seeing right now. From an analytical standpoint, it's a slow burn. It's basically a cascading series of proxy wars, resource grabs, and economic blockades that slowly, almost invisibly at first, draws in every major global power until, eventually, the entire board is engaged.
Now, to analyze this impartially, we've got to view these nations not through a lens of right and wrong, but as entirely rational players responding to incentives on a global chessboard. And that brings us to game theory. By completely ignoring morality for a second and focusing purely on structural imperatives, things like access to resources, defensible geography, and domestic security, we can actually mathematically predict state behavior. Game theory tells us that if a nation is backed into a geopolitical corner, it is inherently incentivized to strike back in very specific ways just to ensure its own survival.
Moving on to Section 2, United States Grand Strategy. If we look at the framework outlined in documents like the U.S. National Defense Strategy, the United States' grand strategy isn't about some arbitrary aggression. It's actually a highly calculated institutional effort to maintain hegemonic stability over the globe. First, this involves securing the Western Hemisphere, creating what is essentially an impenetrable stronghold termed Fortress America. Second, it relies heavily on controlling global maritime choke points, like the Strait of Malacca, to seamlessly restrict the trade flow of any economic rivals. And finally, it absolutely necessitates supercharging the domestic defense industrial base, deliberately shifting manufacturing capacity over from consumer goods to munitions. It's a very systemic, all-encompassing approach to locking in long-term global dominance. So, applying this strategy specifically to the Middle East, Jiang's model suggests the U.S. has executed a major tactical pivot. Because rapid military decapitation strikes fail to force a regional surrender, the strategy has transitioned into a meticulous, three-step war of attrition against Iran. Step 1. Establish forward operating bases in the borderlands, specifically to incite ethnic insurgencies, which forces the Iranian military to overextend itself. Step 2 is blockading critical oil exports to systematically choke off their war financing. And Step 3 is strangling the capital, Tehran, of critical life-sustaining resources like water, food, and electricity to trigger an internal political collapse. You see, it's a slow, methodical constriction.
So how does a regional power respond to that kind of immense pressure? That brings us to Section 3, Iran's asymmetrical defense.
Geography is absolutely crucial here, and it perfectly contrasts the U.S. strategy with Iran's defensive doctrine. Think about flat desert topography, like what you find in Iraq. That terrain practically invites rapid American shock and awe aerial decapitation strikes, meaning the conflict is decisively over in weeks. But Iran's mountainous topography? It effectively turns the entire nation into an impenetrable fortress. This rugged, elevated geography inherently neutralizes flat region military tactics. It fundamentally forces a drawn-out, decentralized guerrilla warfare strategy. Basically, geography alone dictates that any conflict here turns into a grinding war of attrition. And to survive vastly superior American military and surveillance technology within those mountains, Iran utilizes what military doctrine calls the mosaic strategy. This is honestly a fascinating adaptation. Iran intentionally fractures its command structure into 31 localized, highly autonomous armies. Why do that? Well, if your adversary possesses the most sophisticated orbital and drone surveillance in the world, having centralized leadership is a fatal liability. By decentralizing into 31 independent units, hiding deep within fortified mountain bases, Iran effectively neutralizes the threat of a single, war-ending decapitation strike. It ensures the conflict remains a grueling fight right down to the bitter end. But look,
Playing purely defensive survival isn't going to cut it. In a true war of attrition, you have to create agonizing pain points for your opponent. Iran's ultimate geopolitical leverage is actually food security. The nations of the Gulf Cooperation Council rely heavily on external imports for roughly 85% of their entire food supply. So, by leveraging their geographic control over the incredibly narrow Strait of Hormuz, which is literally just 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, Iran can threaten this massive food import reliance of neighboring, U.S.-aligned states. And this isn't merely a regional issue. Shutting down that maritime choke point risks immense global economic chaos, applying devastating indirect pressure right back onto the United States.
This perfectly sets up Section 4. Russia and China intervene on the grand chessboard.
60%. This is a massive number. It represents the percentage of China's energy needs that come directly from the Middle East. Looking at this from a neutral international relations perspective, this highlights a severe, almost existential strategic vulnerability for Beijing. If the U.S. gains total control of the region's supply lines, or if the Middle East descends into complete chaos, China's industrial engine is fundamentally threatened. This single, towering statistic explains mathematically why just standing by in isolation is simply not an option for them.
So, if we zoom out and map the grand strategies of these nations onto what Professor Jiang calls the grand chessboard, we can clearly see a systemic collision course. The United States aims for continued hegemonic dominance using its leverage in tech and the U.S. dollar. Russia seeks to solidify a unified Eurasian bloc relying on its massive geographic size and heavy artillery. Iran wants regional dominance through asymmetrical proxy warfare and geographic chokeholds. Jiang argues that based purely on how these strategic vectors intersect, Russia and China are mathematically forced to intervene in the Middle East. It's really not about ideological friendship, it's about cold, systemic survival and preventing the U.S. from choking off their essential Eurasian trade routes.
And the framework actually maps out a remarkably clear escalation timeline as these nations react to one another. Actually, step 1 is already happening. The U.S. military intercepting and seizing shadow fleet oil tankers in places like the Caribbean to enforce its economic blockades. In direct response to that, Step 2 sees Russia resupplying Tehran via the Caspian Sea, specifically to protect its own exposed southern flank from destabilization. Then, Step 3 brings in China, quietly financing the Iranian resistance using their sprawling belt and road infrastructure. And finally, we reach the ultimate escalation in Step 4. Russia extending its nuclear umbrella over Iran to entirely negate the threat of U.S. or Israeli tactical nuclear weapons. It is a textbook, chillingly logical escalation ladder.
Which leads us to our final part today, Section 5, Systemic Collapse and Cycles.
To really contextualize this grand geopolitical chessboard, Professor Jiang makes a striking historical comparison. He states, the closest historical analogy to today is the Bronze Age collapse. Over 3,000 years ago, it wasn't just one single dramatic event that destroyed flourishing civilizations like the Mycenaeans and the Egyptians. It was a perfect storm. Earthquakes, sweeping famines, disrupted trade supply chains, and localized proxy wars all synergized to trigger a cascading failure of deeply interconnected empires. Jiang uses this ancient collapse as the definitive blueprint for understanding the immense systemic fragility of our globalized world right now.
And if we impartially look at the historical data, the symptoms of late-stage imperial decline are remarkably consistent across millennium. We're talking about extreme, mathematically unmanageable national debt, severe internal political polarization that completely paralyzes domestic governance, militaries that are dangerously overextended on multiple simultaneous global fronts, and highly vulnerable interconnected supply chains, especially when it comes to basic global needs like agricultural fertilizer. According to this academic framework, these historical symptoms of collapse map incredibly closely onto the current structural state of the American empire.
So, I'll leave you with this final provocative thought. As these geopolitical giants increasingly clash over essential resources, energy corridors, and maritime choke points on the grand chessboard, are we simply watching a temporary regional crisis that will eventually simmer down? Or, as game theory and deep historical frameworks might suggest, are we witnessing the definitive end of a 200-year imperial cycle? Thank you so much for watching this explainer. If you want to continue exploring these complex international relations frameworks objectively with us, remember to subscribe to Conflict Explain. Until next time, keep questioning the board.